The Last Harvest, Jean Lewis. From farmer to soldier, to gunslinger. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Luke 10:2. Jean Lewis was on this slow and steady climb to becoming the next in line to run the family's sugarcane business. The hopes and dreams of the young man come to an end when his family's farm is burned along with his young wife inside their home. The men responsible were from the Union Army, and this triggered Jean to run off and join the war, in hopes of finding the men who were responsible. His life turns bitter as he becomes hardened by the battles of the war, but eventually, the young man finds compassion as he helps save a group of slaves. In doing so, Jean defects from the Confederate Army, and continues his search for the men responsible for his wife's death. During his journey for revenge, his notoriety for being a gunslinger becomes well known. This causes much unwanted attention as others ask for Jean's help. Will he find the men responsible for his wife's death, or will the long path of violence he carved out be in vain? Chapter 1. Born in 1840, Jean was the oldest child out of three to Maria and Thomas Lewis. The Lewis were wealthy sugarcane farmers from outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, owning several plantations. All their plantations were run by a family as well as paid labor. The family did not believe in owning slaves like much of the South in their time. The Lewis family was a strong Christian family and believed every man should be free. The family did their best to avoid the looming war that grew ever close to their lands, and would often help a fleeing slave or two. Thomas made sure his family, friends, and fellow workers were protected no matter their color or creed. Thomas did his best to instill such values into his three children, Jean, William, and Evelyn. The two boys were not much into the whole gospel train, but Evelyn followed their teachings and the Bible wholeheartedly. When Jean was of age, he learned the business side of his family's wealth and cane production. One day his father would leave his legacy to his two boys and daughter to run, so Jean dedicated his life and time to learning this trade. He knew it was a great opportunity and did not take any of it for granted. However, that day of Jean running the family business would not see the light. When the Civil War broke out, the country was divided and at war. Northern Union armies marched their way down south trying to conquer the land. Many homes, businesses, and plantation homes were either sacked, held hostage for use, or burned down. Many of the surrounding towns urged the Lewis family to join the war efforts, but time and time again, Thomas held his ground and refused. William, the middle child, did not agree with his father, but Jean often sided with the decision to not march off to war. He was newly married, and Jean did not intend to make his wife a widow at such a young age. Life in their day was hard enough, so blindly rushing off to war and certain death was not something Jean wished to do. As much as the Lewis family tried to stay clear of the war, the inevitable arrived at their doorstep. Fall 1862. Harvesting was in full swing, and everyone in the Lewis family was involved with each aspect. While the men worked tirelessly, the women stayed at home preparing meals for not only the family but the workers. The Lewis's farm was the only farm in the region that did not have slave labor. All their men, white or black, were hired hands and treated with equal pay and dignity. This often caused a few noses to turn up at them in town, but for the most part, the family ignored it. The harvesting lasted almost all of the fall and into the winter months. Louisiana rarely saw snow and kept it at a resembling warm temperature. Some years the winters would be cold, but nothing too extreme to stop work. Most times fall and winter were welcomed with open arms. It gave me a much-needed break from the sweltering hot and humid summer weather. This year's crop was healthy and plentiful. The family would no doubt make a profit, and some of that money would be split between the siblings. Jean had plans to start building his own home separate from the main house. He and his wife Rose had plans for a large family. The two had met very early in life. Some would think they were engaged since elementary school by the way the two were inseparable since childhood. As Jean came of age, around 17, Jean proposed to Rose. Her family had always liked Jean and his family, so there was no dispute in the matter. It was a leg up for this carpenter's daughter to marry a wealthy farmland owner. 3 years had passed since their wedding vows, and the two were still ever in love. Rose had yet to be able to bear any children, but her hopes were high for this year. Jean had always wanted a large family, and the young man would ask the good Lord every night to grant their wishes for children. The sun was high in the sky as the workers made their way down rows of lush green stalks of cane. Thomas was on the cart and watched as the others quickly cut the stalks down and piled them up. Another group of men grabbed the bundles and loaded them on the cart quickly. Jean was out in the fields cutting cane alongside Henry and his youngest brother. Henry was a close family friend and was in charge under Thomas. Even the boys had to answer Henry's commands. Jean enjoyed working with Henry. He learned a lot not only about farming and crops, but life itself. Thomas was often too busy to sit his sons down and speak about certain matters, so often Henry took up that role in Jean's life. William was still young and his head was in the clouds. Being the middle child, Will was often the rebel, and Jean had to raise a voice or hand to his head to get him in line. Henry was the father of James, who was soon to wed Evelyn. The wedding was set for next year after James received his papers to become a preacher. The two were to also settle down on the outskirts of the family land alongside Jean and his wife. "Looks like rain," Henry spoke up as he wiped the beads of sweat from his brow. Jean glanced up at the sky, not seeing a cloud in sight. He glanced over at Henry with a furrowed brow. "How? Isn't the sun shining?" He couldn't help but chuckle. "My old leg is giving me trouble, and that means one of two things. Rain or trouble." He chuckled. "Henry, your leg always gives you trouble." Thomas hollers jokingly from the cart. "That is true, sir, but it is throbbing today." Henry laughed at himself and started to whistle as he cut sugarcane. Jean gently sighed as he used a rag to wipe the sweat off his brow. In the far distance, he could see gray clouds slowly forming. Jean couldn't help but let out a chuckle. The old man was right. Jean continued to work onward in the cool of the fall afternoon. Jean knew sooner or later his mother would be calling them in for supper. Jean stood up straight to take a short break from his labor. His eyes scanned the remaining rows they still had to harvest before glancing back at what they had accomplished that day. He was about to say something witty to Henry before his attention was grabbed by the dark black rolls of smoke coming in the distance. The screams and the realization that the smoke was coming from the main house caused Jean to glance over at his father for answers. However, Thomas was just as shocked and confused as Jean was as to what was going on. Both men shook out of their stupid glance when William yelled, "Jean!" William yelled in fear as pointed to the horizon. Jean and his father turned to face where William was pointing. It was the direction of the house. Jean's heart leaped in his throat as he saw now thicker black smoke rolling over the green sugarcane. Without moments to spare, he darted to the horses that were attached to the cane wagon. Jean unhooked the mare and quickly hopped on. Thomas, Henry, and William were close behind Jean, making a path through the cane. When they finally reached the edge of one field, they couldn't believe what they witnessed. A small group of Union soldiers was fighting with the house staff. A few men were running off with sacks full of silver and food, while 3 remained to punch and kick a few of the men who were around to help defend the loose home. Jean noticed his mother on the ground crying and screaming as she reached for the house. The large plantation was ablaze. A few of the housemaids were holding her back and comforting her. Thomas rode up and ran to his wife when he noticed a soldier walking toward her. "Maria." He gripped her arms tight as he put himself between her and the soldier. "Take it and go," Thomas yelled. "They burned it, they were still inside," she cried out. Jean looked around for his wife but didn't see her. "Rosemary," Jean called out, not wanting to believe she was in the house. He ran towards the inferno calling her name, only to meet with the butt end of a gun. The force and pain knocked him to the ground, and his brother rushed to his side. Jean went to rise with clenched fists, but the Union soldier cocked his gun and pointed it at Jean. "Go ahead, boy," the Union soldier grinned as Jean grimaced in disgust and pain. The man was almost the same age as his dad, but the hard life of war had no doubt hardened him. A scar ran across his face from his bottom lip up to his eyebrow, giving him a menacing look. Gene was not afraid. He wanted to tackle and beat this man for attacking his home and his wife. Gene, his brother William, grabbed his shirt and held him back. Warm crimson blood leaked down the side of Gene's face where the gun had struck. The soldier spit on the ground and smiled as he holstered his weapon. He picked up his bag of loot and he and the others fled into the woods. "Let's go, Charlie," one man yelled at the scared man. Gene's attention then snapped back to the burning home once the men cleared the tree line. "Bros," he screamed again and tried to lunge for the house, but now his brother and father held him back. The intense heat burned their faces, and they knew the waitstaff and Gene's wife were long gone, but Gene didn't want to accept it. Old Henry even had to hobble over and help hold the fighting Gene back from killing himself by trying to run inside the home. Gene finally fell to his knees in defeat and lack of strength. He stared in agony at the raging fire. Flashes of his wife's face ran across his mind. The way her earth-colored hair blew in the breeze and the smell of her skin in the springtime. He would never be able to take the smell of magnolia again. William, Henry, and Thomas let go of Gene. They could do nothing for him. It was as if Gene was frozen on his knees in fear as he watched the house roar in orange flames. It was dusk, and the sun had already sunk below the half-harvested fields. The house was now just embers before him. A charred skeleton of the remains of his childhood home. Gene was still in the same frozen spot, but the rest of the family and servants were scrambling around him. The foundation finally fell, and a gust of hot ash and debris flew toward him. It nearly knocked him over as it took his breath away. Gene finally rose from the spot and walked towards the house. He made his way around the logs and flames looking for something, anything of his wife. Gene wished he would have stayed in his spot, for the sight of his wife's remains was like a knife twisting in his gut. He took a step back and covered his mouth to keep him from screaming. He slowly reached down and took the pendant she had on her charred neck. The piping hot metal scorched Gene's hand, leaving a red circular pattern on his palm. He ignored the pain and clutched what was left of his dead wife inside his hand close to his heart. Tears ran down his cheek and re-wet the dried blood on his face. The young man bent down again and used his boot to flip open the metal box his wife clutched in her other hand. Inside were the 2 fleur-de-lis pins that both of them purchased for their wedding. Gene reached in and took them in his hand. They were burning hot and covered with black soot as well, but it didn't matter. He slipped them into his pocket slowly along with the pendant and turned away. He couldn't bear to look at his wife's body. He didn't want to remember her like this, so he was glad for his mother coming to caress him. His father and other servants gathered the body of his wife as well as the others who were stuck in the blaze. The next day the whole family and work staff had a funeral for the dead. The whole day Gene was silently brewing like the storm clouds in the distance. After the funeral, Gene gathered his things quickly. The heartbroken and vengeful young man was going to join the Confederate Army. His parents protested, but their word fell short. He was going to find the men responsible and make them pay. Chapter 2: Uncompromising disagreements between the free and slave states about the national government's authority to outlaw slavery in the territories that had not yet constituted states, led to the start of the Civil War. 7 slave states in the Deep South seceded to form the Confederate States of America, after Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, won the 1860 election on a campaign promising to keep slavery out of the territories. The majority of Northerners and the incoming Lincoln administration refused to accept the legality of secession. They were concerned that it would tarnish democracy and set a dangerous precedent that would ultimately lead to the dissolution of the United States into several tiny, quarreling nations. On April 12, 1861, a conflict began at Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay. The Confederate Army began to fire on the Federal garrison that day, claiming ownership of the American fort and forcing it to lower the American flag and surrender. To put down this insurrection, Lincoln summoned the militia. 4 more slave states joined the Confederacy after seceding. By the end of 1861, a line spanning 1,200 miles from Virginia to Missouri saw the confrontation of almost 1 million armed men. Several engagements had previously occurred, including those at Wilson's Creek in Missouri, Cape Girardeau in Maryland, and Manassas Junction in Virginia, where Union wins allowed for the establishment of the new state of West Virginia. However, the actual combat started in 1862. In the years that followed, even larger campaigns and battles, from Gettysburg in Pennsylvania to Vicksburg on the Mississippi to Chickamauga and Atlanta in Georgia, were foreshadowed by massive engagements like Shiloh in Tennessee, Gaines' Mill, Second Manassas, and Fredericksburg in Virginia, and Antietam in Maryland. As President Lincoln put it in his speech at Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for Union soldiers killed in the battle there, the original Northern goal of limited war to restore the Union had by 1864 given way to a new strategy of total war, to destroy the Old South and its fundamental institution of slavery, and to give the restored Union a new birth of freedom. The South was also called the Southern Confederacy, and refers to 11 states that renounced their existing agreement with others of the United States in 1860-1861. And attempted to establish a new nation, in which the authority of the central government would be strictly limited, and the institution of slavery would be protected. Louisiana, which controlled the prosperous trading center of New Orleans and contributed the French Creole and Cajun communities to the demographic makeup of a largely Anglo-American nation, was a significant population center in the southwest of the Confederate States of America. Louisiana was a slave state in the antebellum era. During the French and Spanish occupations of the 18th century, enslaved African Americans made up the majority of the state's population. Slavery had already been entrenched by the time the United States took control of the region, 1803, and Louisiana became a state, 1812. Despite having one of the greatest free black populations in the country by 1860, the state still had 47% of its inhabitants as slaves. Slavery was supported by a large portion of the white people, especially in the cities. On January 26, 1861, Louisiana declared its secession from the Union. Due to its southernmost position on the Mississippi River, and its access to the Gulf of Mexico during the Civil War, New Orleans, the largest city in the South, was strategically significant as a port city. Early on, the American War Department had plans to conquer it. On April 25, 1862, American Army forces entered the city. The U.S. government took the unusual step of designating the regions of Louisiana that it was then in control of as a state within the Union. The first year was a bit rough for Gene. Just turning 22, the young lad had to grow up pretty quickly. His southern charm, education, and wits helped him move up in the ranks, as well as gain a reputation. He was an excellent sharpshooter, and his passion to find and kill this Charlie was uncanny. Gene was often described as a lone wolf. He strayed away from the units and fought in a guerrilla warfare type of way, often alone. Some of the other Cajuns in his group called him Rougarou. The word Rougarou is an alternative spelling and pronunciation of the French word loup-garou. The Rougarou folklore is a well-known one in French Louisiana. Southern Louisiana uses both terms interchangeably. The monster is known by various names, including Rougarou and loup-garou. For many generations, the Rougarou tradition has been passed down, either directly through the French settlers in Louisiana, New France, or through the centuries-old French-Canadian immigrants. According to Cajun folklore, the monster prowls the swamps surrounding Acadiana and Greater New Orleans, as well as the local sugarcane fields and wooded areas. Similar to the werewolf, the Rougarou is most frequently characterized as a being with a human body and a wolf or canine head. Much like the Rougarou, Gene was a victorious fighter. His silence and scowl even made some of his men afraid of him. He did not care for this war, or what the South was fighting for. All he cared about was finding and killing Charlie with a scar. The painful memory of that day haunted him daily, the sight of his dead wife, and the scar on his palm was a harsh reminder of his reality. Even his dreams were not safe. Nightmares of not only his wife, but the men he slain in battle began to haunt him, causing him to receive little to no sleep. Jean was always on edge, and even the slightest loud noise or even fire sent him into attack mode. Jean had PTSD due to the carnage of war, but he didn't let that stop him. His passion to find and slay the wrongdoers was strong, and his commander knew this. The commander often gave him false hope by saying the sighting of the scared man was recent. The man fueled Jean's mission of revenge, all the while keeping the commander well pleased. Soon this came to an end. Jean was tasked to accompany a few scouts to find a Union platoon in the area. As the four men made their way down the dirt roads, they came across an overturned wagon. The wagon was turned on its side, spilling out the contents. A handful of black slaves were trying to attempt to fix the wheel and turn the wagon upright. The taskmaster had his whip out and cracked it in the air as he yelled at the men. One of the men in Jean's company stopped to talk to the taskmaster. "What happened here?" the soldier asked. "The Yanks came and ambushed us. They turned over the wagon and stole a few things," the taskmaster explained. The two exchanged words while Jean watched the tree line. One of the slaves attempted to turn the wagon, resulting in it cracking. The taskmaster stopped talking to the soldier and ran after the slave. He began yelling at the man. Jean turned and looked on in disgust. How could another treat a person like that? He then glanced at some of the men in his group harassing the slaves. Jean already didn't care for the soldiers he had to accompany. They were lowlifes from out east who joined the company just to have a chance to kill and plunder. The taskmaster began to hit the younger male with his hand, and the soldier laughed. Jean couldn't take it anymore. "Stop!" Jean yelled. The soldiers turned in shock at Jean speaking less alone, yelling towards someone. "What?" the taskmaster asked in anger. "I said stop," Jean repeated himself as he gave the man a death glare. "Why, this boy won't listen." The taskmaster went to hit the male again, but before he could lay a hand on him, Jean removed his revolver and shot the taskmaster. Shock and pain showed on the taskmaster's face as he looked down at the red spot on his chest. A second later, the man dropped dead. The soldiers with Jean took out their guns and pointed them at Jean. Without blinking, Jean shot the three men dead. Not one could get a single shot off towards Jean. The slaves were all on the ground, covering themselves in fear. Jean noticed them and quickly put his gun away. "You are free. Go on." He motioned for them to run. The men looked at each other and then toward Jean. They were unsure if they could run, or if this man would shoot them as he did his men. "I said you are free. They heard you, they just are scared." The younger man who was getting hit by the taskmaster spoke up. Jean turned his head and watched the young man walk toward him. "I am not going to hurt you. You all are free," Jean repeated. "Why do you have that uniform on then?" the male asked. Jean glanced down at the dirty gray Confederate coat he wore. "I came into this war just looking for a man who did me wrong, that's it. I don't believe in this slavery business," Jean explained. One of the slaves took off running into the woods, while a few still stood shocked at the whole ordeal. "Thank you for helping me, my name is Samuel." The young man held out his hand. Jean took Sam's hand and shook it firmly. "Well, Samuel, you are free." "That may be true, but I have nowhere to go." "Sam, I can't run away. I got a wife back at the master's house." One of the older slaves spoke up. "Do what you need to do." Sam shrugged before turning back to Jean. "Who are you looking for?" Sam asked. "A trio of Union soldiers. One of them has a scar and goes by Charlie. They were the ones who attacked us." The other slave spoke up. Jean's brows raised as he glanced at the man who was speaking. The older man waved to the others and started walking back to the master's house. "You keep this quiet, Marvin. You tell the master, and all of us were killed by soldiers," Sam called out to Marvin. When Sam suggested a cover story for them, the other slave took off running toward freedom. "Which way did they go?" Jean asked. "I can show you if you take me with you," Sam suggested. Jean did not like that idea. "I don't think that would be a good idea." Jean removed his Confederate jacket and tossed it to the side. He was no longer going to serve this army. He was going rogue. I have nowhere else to go, plus you saved my life. Let me at least help you find these men. Sam pleaded. Why? You have a chance to be free. A young man in these clothes in the South, I will be hanged for running away. At least with you, I have a chance. Jean didn't feel like arguing with Sam. Look, you show me where they went and I will think about it. Jean didn't want to waste any more talking about this. His mind was just focused on finding the man, and Sam picked it up. Jean was in a hurry. Alright, follow me. He walked towards the two horses and united them. He gave one of the reins to Jean. I never got your name. Sam mounted the horse and glanced off at Jean, who did the same. They call me the Rugaru. Jean clicked for his horse to start walking. But what is your real name? Sam asked. Jean Lewis. Jean simply said as his horse trotted beside Sam's horse. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Just Jean is fine. Jean huffed. He wasn't one for small talk, and Sam picked up on it. However, Samuel didn't care. He was so happy to be free. My last name is Baptist, at least I think so. My parents were sold off when I was young. Sam continued to tell Jean about his life, as the two rode off to find the Union soldiers. Chapter 3. 6 years and life on the road with Samuel had been a rollercoaster of ups and downs. Jean for the majority of the years had protected the young black male from others who might have hurt him. Even after the slaves had gained their freedom, it didn't stop racist people from having a word or two about Sam. However, the words would be the last they spoke due to either Jean's fist or steel barrel in their mouth. Eventually, Sam grew tired of Jean having to always come to his rescue, and the friendship they had built began to rift a bit. The young man was just happy to be free and in the company of a friend, but he knew eventually he needed to part from Jean. Jean soon picked up on this as well. It wasn't just the fact that Sam felt helpless around Jean, but the constant on the hunt for what seemed like a ghost. The violence and bloodshed began to weigh on the young male's conscience, and Samuel wondered how Jean could not feel the same way. Life on the road was difficult, and the two learned to adapt. They picked up bounties and hired gun jobs along the way on their travels. Jean taught Samuel how to shoot as well as how to outsmart the criminals. Jean was not much of a talker, but Sam didn't mind. Samuel talked to both of them often. Jean was always quick to shoot while Sam tried to talk the criminals into turning themselves over. Sam often tried to reason with the Cajun. The constant words of wisdom often reminded him of how his friend Henry used to guide him, but Jean knew evil could not be reasoned with. It was a shoot-or-be-shot world they lived in, and Jean couldn't understand how Sam could not grasp it. It annoyed him that Sam always tried to find the good in people, but some people were just plain wicked. Jean wished the parting of the two would have been on good terms, but it wasn't. The days started normal. They both rode side by side for days until they reached the next town. Jean and Sam would ask the locals if there had been any sighting of the scared man, as well as if there was any work to be done. To Jean's surprise, there was a wanted poster of the man he was after. His callous hands reached up and plucked the yellowed paper from the side of the post office. His eyes scanned the drawn face of the devil he had been chasing for years. $1,000 bounty read in bold letters under the picture. There was more written below, but Jean ignored it. He didn't care what this Charlie the scared man was wanted for. Jean wanted Charlie's life for the life of his wife. Sam rounded the corner to see Jean just standing there glaring at the paper in his hands. "What is that?" Sam asked as he approached. The young man's smile soon faded when he caught a glimpse of what Jean was holding. Jean broke away from his daze to face Sam. The Cajun didn't say a word, he simply just held up the paper for Sam to take. Samuel took the paper and began to read out loud what was written. Jean ignored him and turned to walk back towards the horse. "Are we leaving already?" Sam asked as he jogged to catch up to Jean. "After we gather provisions, yes." Jean began to walk his horse down the dirt roads of this small town. "We just arrived though." Sam had a hint of disappointment in his voice. That wanted poster is only a few days old. That means Charlie is not far. How do you know that? How do you know we aren't just chasing a ghost, Gene? Sam stopped walking when Gene turned around to face him. Gene held the reins of his painted horse and gave Sam an unsettling glare. That stare sent a shiver up Sam's spine. He didn't like to upset his friend, but Sam wanted Gene to snap to reality. We have been chasing this man for 6 years now. This Charlie is always just out of our reach. I feel like a dog chasing my tail. Sam let the paper drop to his side. The young man wanted to say more, but he didn't have the chance. Gene turned and started to walk towards the general store. Gene knew that it was partially true. The two had been on the rail of this man for a long time. More than most would have wasted on it, but this was personal. Charlie took the life of the woman he loved and destroyed not only his family home but his life. Not a day or night goes by without the nightmares of that day. Most men would have moved on and remarried. Restarted their life and forgot about the incident, but not Gene. He couldn't let this go, and the amount of time he spent chasing this man would be for nothing if he didn't catch him. Gene gathered a few food items for himself and his horse, before setting them on the counter. The store clerk bagged his items and gave Gene his total. Gene handed the man the money and began to collect his things. When was the last time that Charlie on the wanted poster was seen? Gene asked, finally looking up at the clerk. That one? About 3 days now. He and his posse held up the bank in town. But he isn't the worst one. The other fellow that was on the other poster was responsible for the death of a preacher in town. The marshal and the sheriff are rounding up people to go after him. You should look into it. Could be worth a good penny in bounty. Gene ignored the last part of what the clerk said. Which direction was the bank robber headed in? Gene asked. That feller, well, him and his gang of 5 rode off west towards El Paso. Gene nodded to thank the man and turned to exit the store. Gene was met by Sam and the local sheriff at the door. No, Gene spoke before the two men could get a word out. But we haven't even said anything yet. Sam followed Gene as he pushed past them. I have a lead and I'm following it. Gene walked towards his horse and began to feed it. Gene, these men could use our help. We have a chance to do some good. The man is held up in a farmhouse near here. We can help the sheriff and marshal to bring him in. I'm tired to convince Gene to give up this mission of revenge. The annoyed Gene finally turned to face Sam. If you want to go with them to help, go on. You don't need my permission. I am headed towards El Paso. Come on, Gene. We have been after Charlie for 6 years now. Don't you think it is time to hang that cause up and help others who need it? Your skills could be put to good use here. Sam protested. Gene could tell Sam didn't want to continue hunting Charlie, but he also didn't want to stop traveling with Gene. Gene deep down dreaded Sam leaving him alone to his misery. He would only have his hate and thirst for revenge to lead him forward in life if so. No amount of brotherly love or fear of being alone could stop Gene from going to El Paso. Not when a true sitting and lead was before him. Nothing and no one can change my mind. You knew who I was chasing after when we first met. You know my reasons and nothing's gonna change that except a bullet in Charlie Scarface's head. But Gene, but nothing. Go. Join the marshal and sheriff. I have taught you everything I know. You are a good gunslinger and man, Samuel. Leave me to my business. Gene spoke harshly as he slipped his foot into the stirrups of the horse and mounted up. Without another word, Gene pulled the reins of his horse and rode off out of town. Gene had not wanted them to end like this. He had hoped that Sam and he would have stayed together on the road till this was over. He had hoped Sam would have found a girl and settled down on a nice plot of land. As for himself, Gene had no idea what he would do once this was over. Gene had no life but to find Charlie and kill him. He practically disowned his family. No way would they want their murdering son back home. Gene always assumed that he would go down in a blaze of glory. That is how most gunslingers died. In a shootout or a battle. He dreaded becoming the lonely old man sitting and waiting for some criminal or young gun to put a bullet in him while he slept. This life was hard, and it was the last thing he wanted for Sam. It was best for him to get out while he could. Maybe after helping those lawmen, he could settle down. The thoughts and regrets ran through Gene's head, but the gunslinger pushed them aside. He needed to focus on getting to El Paso quickly. He could not delay. He was already 3 days behind the gang. Anything could have or would happen in that amount of time. Someone else could take Gene's revenge. The lawman could pick them up and ship them off to jail. A hangman's noose could be Charlie's end, and not Gene's bullet. Or perhaps the men could decide to go elsewhere. The trip to El Paso could be a dead end for Gene, and the hunt would bring the Cajun back to square one. The last thing he wanted was to feel that he was just riding in circles. Sam ended up joining the lawmen. The young man aided the capture of the criminals successfully and with bravery. His actions lead the marshal to take Sam under his wing to train him. Sam would no longer be a hired gun, but a lawman. He wanted so badly to hold a grudge against Gene. To blame him for wasting years of his life, Sam was not that kind of person. He knew Gene had his reasons for his actions. Sam only wished the two had left on better terms. A few years later, after he was a full-fledged marshal, Sam did marry. The new marshal built a house in South Louisiana, and he and his wife had 5 children. Sam always hoped to run into Gene almost every day. He missed his friend and would often tell the stories of him and Gene to his children. El Paso was considered one of the most dangerous cities in the Old West, thanks to its history of gunfights. Perhaps the most famous El Paso battle was the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. April 14, 1881. 4 men were killed in a gunfight that lasted less than 5 seconds. The gunslinger responsible for the deaths was Gene. He tracked Charlie and cornered him. The words in battle were intense, and Gene was able to gun down Charlie's 4 men. Charlie was wounded, but like a snake, he slipped away. The only reason he escaped was due to Gene's injuries. The Cajun almost succumbed to them, but his determination to follow through on his vow for vengeance kept him alive. The wounds he sustained had the aging Cajun off his horse and hunting for months. Even after he was able to walk, the doctor forced the man to take it easy. Gene was practically held against his will from leaving. He would have to start at square one and begin the hunt for Charlie all over again. In the meantime, Gene kept the peace in the town. He was paid handsomely. Many wanted him to stay, but Gene had other things in mind. He took his earnings 6 months later and rode off toward New Orleans. Chapter 4, 1882. I'm a damsel, I'm in distress, but I am far from helpless. Bon journey, monsieur. The dark-haired French woman kept a firm smile as she addressed the male in front of her. Now, Mrs. Morgan, you are a widow, and this place could use a hired hand to keep you safe. The male continues to speak in a flirting tone with the pale woman. Art Morgan was a fine man. He turned himself from an outlaw to a gentleman just for you to miss, and he would be rolling in his grave if he saw you in here pestering me and trying to get in my petticoat. I know exactly what you are after, and you won't find it in any of my business or with me. There are plenty of salons and whorehouses to go around. Find it elsewhere. The whole time she spoke she kept a smile on her face and a mean look in her eyes. Most folks knew not to mess with Margot Blanchette Morgan. Even before she married an outlaw and turned him into a businessman, she was a tough cookie. Margot's parents had migrated from France to New Orleans to set up their textiles and clothing stores. They were well known for their high fashion, as well as clothes within reason for the lower classes. Everyone deserved to look their best was their motto. Margot had taken over the family business in New Orleans, and soon caught the eyes of Art Morgan, an outlaw. 2 dated on and off for a year and were married. The outlaw settled down to become a businessman, but soon tragedy struck when he passed through the shootout. Ever since, many suitors have graced her building doors trying to win a chance at taking Margot as a wife or mistress, but she refused everyone. Recently, few petty crimes had been committed at her shops and warehouses. On top of everything else, the mayor of the city continued to ask for a dinner date with the famed widow. However, she declined every time. Margot just wanted to live her life and run her business in peace. The man before her leaned on the counter and continued to try and sweet-talk Margot. She grew tired and reached under the counter. Her hands remained under as she reached for the pistol hidden underneath. When the man paused for her reply, Margot cocked the hammer of the gun back onto the counter. The clicking sound made the man uneasy and he stood up straight with his hands in the air. Margot was a lady, but she did have a mean streak if she was pushed. Her blue eyes glared at the man as she proceeded to curse him out in French. The man had no idea what she was saying, but he knew she was upset. One of the employees came running and grabbed the male by the shoulder. "You best be getting or Mrs. Morgan is gonna lose her temper. Today is not a good day for her," the male employee explained as he walked the man out. When Margot was sure the man had left, she uncocked her pistol and removed her hand from under the counter. "Mrs. Morgan, can't keep scaring them off like that. One day one of them is liable to shoot you." Emma, her other employee, and the manager of her store, spoke as she walked toward Margot. Emma Bro was Margot's dear friend. Her family had set her free from slavers when she was a child. Margot was older and pretty much raised Emma as a young sister. "Oh Emma, they would be doing me a favor," Margot teased. "You know, it wouldn't be a bad idea to get some security around here. Especially since all the break-ins," Emma suggested. Margot rolled her eyes and cursed in French again. "I know, but I do have my theories about that." Margot turned to walk to the back of the store. "So you won't be mad if I go looking?" Emma called out. She could barely make out what Margot said, but Emma would do what she wanted, despite what Margot wanted. "Across town. I believe this means I win." Jean sat his cards down. He smiled and pulled the winnings towards him. The gunslinger had recently found a saloon inside the bustling city of New Orleans and spent his day gambling. He needed to take a break from the road, as well as try and round up a few dollars for his trips. Jean acquired most of his earnings from being a hired gunner in occasional bounty hunt, but today he was earning some coin from gambling. "You cheat." The loud-mouthed man slammed his cards down. Jean sat still and unmoved as he glared up at him. The others around Jean gasped. "Jasper, don't. You know who he is." One man spoke up. "I don't care. He is a cheat." Jasper yelled as Jean ignored him. The man continues to yell when they finally tell him. "That is Jean Lewis, the Cajun, also known as Rue." Jasper's face went white. He shut his mouth and took his hat off. "Sir, I am so sorry." Jasper almost swallowed his dip as he started to back away. Jean smirked as he glanced up at him. "It is fine. How about you sit the rest of your winnings down and we call it even?" Jean lifted a brow and watched as the man pulled coins from his pocket. He tossed them on the table and ran out of the room. As he ran, he almost knocked over Emma. Emma noticed the man Jasper feared and walked towards him. If any thug was running out the door due to a fella, then he would be perfect for the job. Mr. Emma spoke up as she walked towards Jean's. "Sorry, Cher, you are beautiful, but I'm not here for that kind of company. I am only here for a drink and a few games." Jean spoke as he counted his earnings. Emma's lips twisted into a frown. "I am no whore, nor am I here for that. My employer and friend need help with a situation," she began to explain. "I'm not here for that either." Jean tried to be rid of the young woman. "Listen, mister. I am here because we need a hired gun. Mrs. Margot is stressed enough being alone and a widow, but these break-ins and thieves in her store are too much. Half these men around here are crooks and creep. We need a proper gunslinger to help. I feel a conspiracy is brewing and we need your help." Emma placed her hands on her hips. "How old are you?" Jean asked. 20. "Aren't you a little young to be asking around for gunslingers?" Jean placed his hat back on his head and glanced up at her. "Aren't you a little old to be passing up good jobs when they come to you? A man like you must not get many offers." Jean chuckled at her response. "Look, miss, I am only here to relax and enjoy myself. I am sure there are others around who can help," Jean replied. Emma was about to protest when Margot walked in. Everyone in the saloon grew quiet and watched Margot make her way effortlessly toward Emma. Margot began to speak to Emma in French. Emma, this is no place for a lady like yourself, come now. But Margot, we need help. Even if you are too proud to ask. Emma replied in French. No one else could understand them except Jean. He stood up and removed his hat. His eyes scanned the features of the madam. She was older than Emma. This was Margot, the woman who Emma spoke to if she needed help. She was at least a few years younger than him, but not untouched by this hard world. She held herself as a proper woman with class and elegance. She seems to teach her younger friend this as Emma spoke and compassed herself with such mannerisms. Jean replied to them in French. No harm, madam. She was only inquiring for help is all. Jean gave them both a warm smile. Margot was a bit shocked that the stranger could speak French. It is not unheard of, just rare. I apologize for the interruption, monsieur. We will take our leave. Emma went to protest, but Margot gave her a look. It wasn't a harsh one, it was more of a tired, worn-out look. Margot was stressed, and she did not have the time or effort to deal with this. Margot nodded to Jean before turning to exit. Emma gave the gunslinger a last pleading look before following Margot out. Emma, I warned you about places like that. Ladies like us are not to be seen there. Margot rushed down the street. Her red dress dragged behind her on the cobblestones. She was getting a bit out of breath due to the corset she was wearing, and soon slowed down. Emma was right behind her. I know, but we need help. We are fine. Margot glanced behind her as she weaved through people. Margot paused and waited for the horse and carriages to pass before she continued across the street. No, we aren't. You shouldn't have to deal with this, Margot. Between the crimes and the men's constant coming around, I know I am here for you and will always be, but we can't fight them off. Especially if it is that trash mayor doing this all to push up to date him. He is doing this to others on the block, not just me. He wants all the major business in his back pocket. He just pushes me harder because I am a widow and beautiful. You flatter me, Emma, but please leave it alone. As the women walked away, Jean watched them. He placed a cigarette in his mouth and inquired about the two. A fellow guest at the saloon told the gunslinger the story of Margot and her young apprentice Emma. The next day, as smooth as Tennessee whiskey, Jean stood on the balcony and watched the street below. He watches Mrs. Margot pass below, accompanied by one of her male employees. The lady had caught his eye the other night in the saloon. She was elegant, pose, hard as nails, and ever so much a lady if he ever saw. The widow was in hard times, but Jean didn't want to get involved. He just narrowly escaped death on his last mission. The Confederate opened his flask and took a swig. Margot paused as glanced up at the saloon. She noticed the gunslinger on the balcony looking down at her. Their two eyes locked for a moment before they were parted by the bellowing of a male's voice. "Ah, Mrs. Morgan. Lovely day, isn't it?" The mayor removed his hat and smiled at Margot. Margot forced a smile on her face as she faced the mayor. "I suppose so, Mayor Travis. It would be even better if the criminals who keep breaking into my shops were caught. In a city of this size and prestige, you would think something like this would be handled." Margot rose a brow as she glanced over at the mayor. She removed her fan and began to fan the heat away. "I assure you, madam, we will look into the matter." "I hope so. I find it rather odd that only my stores are being broken into and no one else's. Peculiar." Margot knew the mayor had something to do with it. The mayor gave her a crooked smile. "I can have my men on it, madam. You can accompany me to my manor if you wish to feel safe." The words infuriated Margot. "Oh, Mrs. Morgan doesn't need to do that." A raspy voice spoke up from behind her. Jean stepped out from behind Margot and adjusted his Confederate hat. The mayor's smile faded into a frown. Margot glanced up at Jean and then toward the mayor. She smiled with satisfaction at the way Jean made the man fume. "And you are?" the mayor asked. "Jean Lewis. I have recently picked up Mrs. Morgan's case." The mayor was at a loss for words. "Yes. Mr. Lewis is going to find the criminals breaking into my place and handle them properly. Now if you excuse me, Mayor, I have work to complete. Margot folded her lace fan and walked past him. Her employee walked behind her holding textiles with his head down. Jean remained for a few moments more to study the major. He then smirked before walking past him. The mayor watched them walk away together. Watch them. And get me information on Mr. Lewis. He spoke to his men who were beside him. You didn't have to do that, Margot spoke as she continued forward. It was entertaining. That yank of a mayor has no clue how to run a city. Jean added. That is true, but I believe he is a bit distracted by his vices. She replied. And those vices are the same as any man. I just believe he is reaching too far trying to corner a lovely lady like yourself. Jean walked alongside Margot. The corruption runs deep with Mayor Norman Travis. He and the railroad have a monopoly, and they tend to search it down here from New York to the port of New Orleans. She explains. Where do you fit in all this? Jean asked. Margot glanced over to Jean and sighed. My family's textile empire and the fact that lust burns in his eyes for me. She spoke in disgust. Margot and Jean stopped in front of one of her shops. She sighed deeply and turned her face upwards to face him. I thank you, Mr. Lewis, but I do not want your blood on my hands or consciousness. The only blood will be that Billy Yank's, madam. Jean tipped his hat. Don't worry, Cher, you have an angel on your side. Margot didn't respond as she turned and walked up the stairs to her business door. She paused as she held the doorknob. She turned to study him as he stood there. His dark blonde and gray wispy hair under his hair complemented his goatee. He wore a gray tweed overcoat and pants with a blue vest. On each side were fleur-de-lis pins. He was a well-dressed gentleman. Something she would never have guessed of a gunslinger. He was a handsome older gentleman. Probably in his late 40s. He was educated and his smooth words were charming and not brash. Name your price, Mr. Lewis. She spoke assertively. $5 a week. Margot nodded in agreement. The week had just barely begun, and Jean already had gunned down 3 men. They tried to break into the main factory to loot the place, but the Cajun took care of them. After he finished making his rounds, Jean decided to check out the clothing store to make sure everything was alright. Jean entered the dark and quiet building, and made his way toward the back of the store. To his surprise, Jean found Margot in the darkness. She was nursing a glass of amber liquid in the dark. He only saw her due to the moonlight outlining her silhouette. Mr. Lewis hard at work, I see. Her voice was soft. Yes, ma'am. I am about done with my rounds. May I ask why you are here in the dark, alone? He removed his hat and held it in front of his chest like a gentleman. Trying to solve my problems with a bottle like everyone else, just alone. Margot lit the candle on the small table that sat beside her. We should be drinking alone together. Drowning the pain is normally better with somebody else who has problems. I know this drink won't solve them, but misery loves company. Jean chuckled as he sat across from her, placing his hat on the table in front of him. Oh? What problems does a lone gunslinger have? I do envy you. Out and about. Able to come and go as you please. She chuckled and poured him a glass. Jean thanked her and took a sip. The title of gunslinger has its problems. Looking over your shoulder at all times. You have to have wit and skill if you are to live as long as I have, he confesses with a smirk. How did you end up out here? Margot asked. Jean took another long sip before telling her his story. Margot listened intently to every word that he spoke with his smooth Cajun accent. The gunslinger was quite charming. Margot would have never guessed he was in that profession. She finished her glass. The liquid warmed her belly and put her at ease. Jean could tell in the way her demeanor changed from stern to relaxed. Her lazy smile let him know the alcohol was taking its effects. Being she was a proper lady, and his boss, Jean didn't want to step over the line. She was a beautiful woman, and he would go all the way with her if she asked him to, but he respected her too much to. Let alone take advantage of her situation. Lonely people with spirits of whiskey lowered their inhibitions. Margot watched the flame dance in his hazel eyes. The handsome stranger who once dismissed her friend Emma's request for hiring was now situated across from her under her employment. Margot had been alone for so long that she almost forgot what it felt like to be held by a man. The thought lingered a little too long in her mind. She could blame it on the drink, or was the thought there already and only brought out by the glass? The short-lived fantasy was replaced by the dreadful thought of the mayor. The nerve of that man thinking he could bully her into submission to wed him. The thought made her stomach turn sour for a moment, but the feeling faded when she glanced again into the gunslinger's kind eyes. Jean knew he had to leave. He didn't want to stain the fair madam's reputation of being a true lady. Not only that, but he still felt guilty about not avenging his wife's murderers. After all these years of searching and gunning down other men, he still could not put the lead into the right man. His iniquities haunted him nightly. He knew he could never settle down with another like before. His bloody path of vengeance would no doubt come full circle, and he would be mostly killed himself. He slowly stood up and retrieved his hat from the table. "I bid you good night, mademoiselle." He placed his hat on his grey wispy hair and tipped it. "Good night. I enjoyed our chat. Perhaps another time then. We may continue. When it isn't so late, that is." Margot knew he was a gentleman only looking out for her honor. She nodded with a warm smile. Of course. Chapter 5. The morning came with the sound of horse hooves as a gang of 5 men rode into town. The mayor had hired them to take out the gunslinger, so he could have better access to Margot. Margot quickly made her way out of her shop and out onto the porch. She was not afraid to face them. Her patience were running thin with the mayor. She wanted to mount up a horse and ride to his large home and put a bullet in him, but her morals stopped her. "I see you took the blood money to come in to scare these folks," she hisses as she grasps her blue skirt to avoid the mud. "It could have been avoided, Mrs. Morgan." The leader of the gang spoke up from his horse. He smiled as his men ran up and down the small streets of the block they were on. "This whole city and you so happen just to come to my side, huh? So subtle your boss is." She grits her teeth. Emma ran out trying to bring Margot back in before she got hurt. "I can see why the mayor likes you." He looked her up and down. The man's eyes disgusted her. Her eyes then shot to the deputy that stood on the post beside her. "I suppose you are on the payroll as well, allowing those criminals to tear up this block of the city," she scolded the man. The deputy just spits his dip on the ground. Suddenly gunshots rang down the street in an alley. "Harold, that you?" the man leader called out to one of his men. Jean stepped out from the alleyway holding his trusty repeater rifle. The gun was a deadly weapon, but in Cajun's hands, it was a precision killing machine. "My boots barely had time to hit the floor before you decided to roll in." Jean stood with the rifle on his hip pointing upward. The leader turned his horse to face the Cajun. "And who are you that I should care about?" he cursed. One of the gang members that was beside the leader turned his horse around and began to ride away. The gang leader yelled at his man. "Where are you going?" "That is the Cajun," he screamed in fear. The few remaining townsfolk took cover inside. Margot continued to stand her ground in front of her store. "I have a real bad feeling that something bad is about to happen." Emma backs up into the store. "The Cajun?" The leader was confused. "I suggest you run along and ride out of here now. Before you upset me. You hear? Go on now. There are 4 of us." "3. Jean corrected him before he could finish. The leader shook his head and whistled. A man stepped out from the top balcony across from Jean. Jean was quicker and shot the man point blank from 50 yards. The man fell from the balcony. The other gang member came riding up from the other side of the street, and Jean shot him as well. While Jean shot them, the leader tried to pull to shoot Jean. However, Margot quickly grabbed the deputy's gun and shot the leader's shoulder. He let out a scream. The deputy was shocked at what she did but quickly reached for his gun. He had to peel it from her hand. Jean swung his rifle to focus on the leader. "Get on now. Go tell your mayor I'm coming to peel that tail." The cowardly leader held his shoulder and kicked his horse's side. The horse took off out of town. Jean lowered his rifle as he approached Margot. "You alright, Cher?" he asked with a bit of worry in his voice. Margot cursed in French at the deputy before turning to go inside her business. Jean followed her inside and watched her pace in anger. Jean stood by the window and kept his eyes on the street. Mace lost seams that lit a fire under them. He chuckled as he glanced back. "This has to end soon." She spoke in anger as her voice crackled. Her hand went to her forehead and Emma took her by the hand. "Sit, Margot. By the way, nice shot, Mrs. Morgan," Jean complimented. "I missed it. I was aiming for his ridiculous face." Margot confesses as she sits down to try and calm down. "We have to figure something out, Mr. Lewis. I and Mrs. Morgan can't live like this anymore." Emma spoke up. "I know. Believe me, after today and those Cajuns. It is time we bring the fight to Mayor Travis." Jean walked towards Margot and knelt in front of her. Emma went to get her some water, leaving the two alone. "I promise you, madam." His voice was low as he spoke softly to her. He could tell her nerves were over the edge. He often suffered from extreme episodes of PTSD. The nightmares, the shaking hands, and fear. This was due to the horrors of war and the guilt he felt. No one should have to go through what he went through, and no one should have to go through what Margot was facing. It was terrifying to have a man pursue you in such a way. She had a tough exterior and hid her pain well, but the worry and hurt in her eyes gave it away. He slowly reached to place a hand on her. She was trembling but stopped when he touched her. He kept eye contact with her even though hers were spaced out. She was having an episode he was all too familiar with. "Hey, it is okay. I am here. Focus on my voice, hey." He moved his head a bit so he was directly in front of her. Margot shed a single tear, and Jean sat his rifle on the ground. His thumb caught the tear before it fell from her ivory face. "It will get better, will it?" she protests. Jean tilted his head. Margot wanted to just give up and give in. Others were suffering for her. "We are just born to die, why make these people suffer in between?" Margot took a deep breath. "Don't give in to this tyrant, Mrs. Morgan. Men like him think they can have whatever they want. You stay strong and stand up for your morals." He tried to comfort her. "It is gonna take a miracle to take a man like him down." "Well, my mama always taught me to pray when your back is against the wall." Jean smiled up at her. Margot could not help but give him a faint smile. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. His rough but warm hands smelled like gunpowder and smoke, but they gave her a sense of safety. Emma came back and handed Margot a glass of water. Margot lifted her head and hands to accept the water. Jean then slowly took his rifle from the ground and stood up. He watched her drink the water a moment before turning to Emma. "Who all in this town is not under the mayor's thumb?" he asked. "Not many, but there are a few," Emma replied. "Round them up." Jean then turned to Exeter store. Chapter 6. A few people from the town came to meet Mrs. Morgan and Mr. Lewis. Margot explained that they would need their help to rid this mayor. He was not only hurting Margot but the others' businesses as well. He was crooked and he needed to be overturned. The city needed a new mayor. The people at the meeting agreed and also agreed to help the gunslinger overthrow the mayor and his goons. Jean would need to train the few able bodies to shoot and fight. He explained he had to show them years of experience in only a few days. Any longer and the mayor would most likely find out what they were doing. The few days of training were hectic. It was past midnight around this small joint. The owner kept his eyes scanning the area every 10 minutes before he lit a candle right next to the window to let the others know. The angel of death was behind the joint. He kept his guard up the whole hour, barely blinking or paying attention to anything else. Mrs. Morgan and Emma were already inside. They would normally stay away from such places, but that was perfect for their meeting. Emma's wit and intelligence was the main key to gathering up some people. She wouldn't let her employer take the risk or trust the wrong person. Emma was sharp and could look at their intentions so easily. She spoke with some locals, the ones that mattered, to decide this. The doctor, the newbie journalist that arrived in town just 2 weeks ago, the preacher's wife and teacher, and one of the local hookers. The meeting was small, only 10 chairs were placed around the tables in the hope for others to come. Right in the middle of the table sat a bottle of whatever strong liquor they had on hand, as well as a pitcher of water. The joint owner also insisted on getting canned peaches, just to make the meeting more important. All of them sneaked into the joint between space-times, some overlapped, but they tried not to make much fuss about it. Gene was not very comfortable with large meetings. He would stay at the back door and listen to the first words while smoking pre-rolled. He would decide later whether to step in or not before Mrs. Morgan asks him for it. Margot took a deep breath once everyone took their seats around the tables. According to her education, it was always the man that would start the conversation, sweeten up things, and explain the scenario, but Gene refused to start the speech. He was just a hired gun, people would recognize him or not, but most towns had issues with gunslingers. Emma looked back at her employer and took her hand just to support her. Margot gave her a faint smile and then addressed them to their companions. "Evening, everyone. I would like to thank you all for coming," she said. "Most of you are here because of our situation with the current major. We know he won't be looking for the interests of this town when his main focus is to fill his pockets. This small community here in this great city of New Orleans has all potential to grow, but with men like him in power, it's impossible. I believe we should call out his behavior and get a new major, a fair one." "Like who?" "You, ma'am." One of the random guests spoke from the back. "Not exactly, that's why we are all here, to decide," Margot replied. "The major has some hired guns, ma'am. They might be against it, and God save us, they might come after us or whoever conspires." Another spoke. "True, but he ain't going if we do nothing." The grumpy doctor spoke. The young journalist started to scribble all the words that came from her mouth. Sometimes his pen made so much noise that Emma threw him murderous glares to make him stop. "We can't sit idly by any longer. My business as well as yours are all at stake, not to mention the innocent people who get in his way. He is using us. The mayor just wants to gather business for himself and run you out of town or make it impossible to work without his or his people's help." Norman Travis and his railroad partners from New York contended on owning this great city like they do all the others that run along down from New York. "The port of New Orleans is a main notch in the belt," Emma explained. "Why can't we just call the law?" one asked. "He owns the law," Emma added. "What about a marshal?" "He doesn't own them," the doctor asked. "Who knows, he might. We don't know how deep his pockets go. Plus, there aren't any marshals around these parts. It would take weeks to get word to one. Not to mention if they would believe us and come to our aid. Do what you want, but I'm gonna find a marshal. Call me a coward, but I know what a bullet does to a man or woman. I had to cut off limbs in the war." The old doctor stood up and hobbled out of the business. "This mayor has taken over the town, but Maggot's family was supposed to run the town," the young journalist added. "I did my research and your father was the one elected, madam." The bombshell of truth ricocheted throughout the quiet room. "If that is true, and we have a fair election and I am elected, then I will do my best to run this city. For you all and the honor of my father." "Still doesn't resolve the issue with Mayor Travis and his horrible men," the one prostitute spoke up. "That is why we have asked Mr. Lewis here to handle that. Even if he is as good as they claim he is, there are a lot of hired hands to fight off," the journalist added. Margot sighed deeply and glanced back at Jean. He could tell she was running out of patience and answers to their questions. These few that showed up would be more of a hindrance than a help to him. Jean stood up and approached the table. "You let me worry about them. What I need for you all is to help me acquire a few things. Anything you need, mister, it is yours. For one, I need to know the exact amount in this mayor's gang. A head count of his men as well as house staff. I also need a layout of his mansion and a time schedule of his coming and going." "So you want us to spy for you?" the prostitute asked. "Yes. If everyone could compose that information for me, it would help greatly. I also need gunpowder and dynamite, he added. For what purpose? Margot asked. I am still figuring that part out, Jean confessed. So that means we are dismissed? One asked. Jean nodded towards them as they all slowly rose from their seats and exited the building. Margot was worried and it showed clearly on her face. I hope you have a plan, Mr. Emma said. Honestly, I am just trying to figure everything out. I can't risk those folks' lives any more than I have. This is my fight. I was paid to be a hired gun, and I will do that to the best of my abilities. Chapter 7. Over the next few weeks, the few townsfolk wanting change gathered the info for Jean. Even the whole wait staff in the manor wanted the mayor gone. They would do anything Jean asked them. The plan was simple. Place various tents around the building, nothing connected, just for show. Have the wait staff run out and panic as if it was true. If this did not startle the mayor and his men to flee, well then Jean and a few other men would be ready to have a gunfight to take over the manor. This plan was gone over by everyone and set in motion by the month's end. Once the mayor and his goons talked, a new and voted in mayor would take his place. It would be one of the townsfolk, or possibly Margot, that would take the role. Anyone who would stop the corruption and help the town was needed. Jean and the others who were willing to help rode out to the manor. Everyone knew exactly what they needed to do, but Jean was still a bit on edge. He knew that sometimes when the heat of battle was strong, those who were of good courage would flee from fear. He saw it many times over this life from soldiers and criminals, and these people were simple town folk. The horse halted at the end of the long driveway, and Jean dismounted. He signaled for the two men on the end of the small posse to go and take positions. Jean signaled the others to go around back and wait for his signal. Jean would walk the long dirt pathway alone. He didn't want to spoil the surprise he had in store for the mayor. Jean hitched his horse to the small fence by the entryway and began to make his way slowly toward the manor. The workers in the field noticed Jean and signaled to the others it was time to get into place. As Jean approached the large porch, the two men guarding the house perked up. "Who are you?" one of them asked as they spit out a wad of tobacco. "I am here to speak to the mayor." Jean paused just shy of the front step. "He isn't seeing anyone right now." "Oh, I think he will want to see me," Jean replied. "Why is that?" the one man asked. "I am here on behalf of Mrs. Morgan and the others in town." Jean glanced between the two men. They both burst out in laughter. "You have to be joking. You? Alone here to talk to the mayor?" The men stopped laughing when the mayor stepped out. "What is going on here?" Norman asked. "This man said he is here to see you," the one guard replied. "Is that so?" "Let me guess, the canon who Mrs. Morgan hired to protect her business." Jean stood silently as he glared at the men. "Well, sir, you are outgunned here. I think you should move along and find another employer. That business and most of the town is practically mine now, unless you wish to come work for me, that is." The mayor's face twisted in a grin as the other two men chuckled. "I'm here to run you out of town." Jean reached in his pocket and pulled out a single roll of dynamite. "You can go quietly, or you can go out with a bang." Jean wiggles the stick. "What are you talking about?" Norman's grin turned into a frown. "I placed dynamite all over the building. Inside and out." That phrase was the signal. The house caretakers one by one started to run out screaming. Maids, butlers and even the kitchen staff ran out screaming. The mayor and the two guards froze and watched the scene unfold before him. The mayor managed to stop one of the maids and ask her what the chaos was about. "There's dynamite in the house, sir, and men are surrounding the back," she yelled and wiggled out of his grasp. She ran past Jean and followed the others down the dirt driveway. The mayor tried not to panic, however this did not stop the two guards beside him. "I don't get paid enough for this," one yelled as the both ran off down the dirt driveway. "Do I have your attention now?" Jean asked. The mayor was silent, but not for long. He noticed his other guards riding up on horseback from the right side of the field. "My men will make short work of this," he hissed. Gene placed a hand on his gun and watched as the three men rode up and dismounted the horses. To his horror, the main leader of the pack was Charlie. Gene glared at them and fought the urge to gun them all down right then and there. To his surprise, the men that are the Major's main bodyguards were the same men that burned his family home and killed his wife. The same scar-faced snake he had been chasing. That old devil. The showdown with Charlie had begun. The two glared at each other with murder in their eyes. The mayor yelled for Charlie to shoot, but he did not budge. Just as they were about to grab their guns and fire, a man yelled from behind Gene to stop them. The preacher's wife had spilled the beans about everything. Him and a few others had taken their requests to the marshal's office. They didn't know exactly when the marshal would arrive, so the preacher made his way down to stop anything he could. "Mister, please. You don't need to do this. The law is coming." The preacher tried to get between the men, but Gene pushed him away. "It is too late for that now." Gene growled as he tried to move the preacher. "No, it is never too late. I think it is the Bible, man. Me and LA boy Gene here have history." Charlie spoke up. The preacher continued to beg and wanted Gene to turn the men into the law, but Gene pays no attention. The preacher goes on a speech about how he knows he once was a Christian, and how Gene knows better. How he should have used himself to be a harvester of souls and not a killer of them. How even though his life strayed, he can still use his talents for good. How Gene could bring the evildoers into the law for justice. How what Satan meant for evil, God can turn it for good. With each sentence, Charlie laughed louder and louder. "You are wasting your breath, preacher. Gene here has been hunting me down for all his life. You think our feud can just be settled in a moment with flowery words? No. We settle this now, with lead." The preacher knew it was no use to keep wasting his breath. The preacher finally stepped out of the way and began to pray silently from the sidelines. The two men were so focused on each other, they didn't hear the marshals right up behind Gene. "Gene, I think this has gone on long enough." The man's voice made Gene's ears perk up. Samuel, Chapter 8. The marshals had finally showed up, and to Gene's surprise, it is the slave he saved years ago. Gene had always wondered what became of his friend. That day many years ago, and the harsh words he spoke often haunted the Cajun. "Gene, I think it is time you finally listened to reason." Samuel dismounted his horse and walked towards the men with his rifle pointing downwards. "Ah, Marshal. I am glad you are here." The mayor finally spoke up. "You hush, Mayor. You are in a heap of trouble. The amount of evidence we have on you is damning. You and your men are looking at a trial. They won't make it to trial." Gene grunted between clenched teeth. "Time to stop killing, Gene." Samuel raised his voice. Gene stood quietly, eyeing not only the men but his old friend. "Seems you made your way up in the world," Gene muttered. "And it seems like you finally found your man, but I can't allow you to kill him." "And why not?" Gene hisses. "He deserves a trial. You know what he has done. And what I have gone through chasing him down. No. This is my justice to serve." "It is not justice but revenge," Samuel proclaimed. "So be it." "No, Gene. This has to end. Your whole life wasted on this pursuit of evil has turned you into the very man you chased." Gene ignored Sam and raised his gun, aiming it at Charlie. Samuel stepped in between the two men. Gene continued to aim the gun as his eyes moved to meet Sam's. "Get out of the way, Sam. I couldn't stop you then, but I will stop you now. I will see to it that he gets his punishment, but not from you, not like this." Samuel and Gene continued to glare at each other without moving. The unspoken words between them were clear. Gene would either have to back down and allow Samuel to bring them in, or Gene would have to shoot his friend in order to kill his enemies. Seconds felt like hours as Gene continued to aim the gun. Everything he had worked for and sought after was in his reach, but he was unable to obtain it. He lowered the gun slowly. As much as Gene wanted this man dead, he could not hurt Samuel to do it. "Arrest them." Samuel motioned for the other marshals to arrest the mayor and his men. The whole time Gene watched the men be carted off while Samuel watched Gene. Charlie and his men's trial was short. They were hanged a week later. Jean of course watched from a distance, cursing the fact he wasn't the one doing the killing. The mayor was shipped off back to New York to additional trials there. A new mayor was elected, and all had seemed to be put right for everyone except Jean. His whole life was devoted to killing Charlie. He really had nothing left after Charlie was dead. He was still upset that Samuel stopped him, but he knew and understood why he did it. Samuel extended an invitation for Jean to join the marshals once more, but Jean refused. The preacher also asked for Jean to stay and help with the rebuilding of the town, and even help in the church, but Jean refused that as well. Margot even extended her hand for him to stay with her, but he refused. Jean would ride off west to try and do something to do with his life for some sort of peace. I really thought he would stay or at least join us under the badge. He will never find peace unless he gets back with Jesus. Samuel. We both know that. He knows that. Jean has the knowledge of both the law and the Bible, and refuses to do both. The preacher spoke as he stood beside Samuel. The harvest is great, but the laborers are few. The preacher sighed and patted Samuel's shoulder. I pray Jean comes to his senses. Life is short and he is up there in age. Surprised he lasted this long. Gunslingers rarely see old age. Samuel glanced over at the preacher. God has mercy on dear Jean, and he isn't done with him yet. Lieutenant 2 King James Version, KJV 1900. 2 Therefore said he unto them, the harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he would send forth laborers into his harvest. Jesus then turns to his followers and informs them that the crop has already been plenteous. Only a few workers, though, are willing to go out and gather the ready crops. By saying this, the Son of God is actually stating that there is a ripe harvest of lost souls. They long for a decent shepherd to guide them and are eager to learn about God's kingdom. However, most Christians do not actively reach out to share the good news of salvation with them. They should be pointing them to Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life.